I'm walking back and forth in Dry Lake trying to get the... There you go. My goddamn SSD, I load too fast. Flasks in your belt refill as you kill enemies. Interesting that they mentioned belts. Yet, without wearing a belt, you could use flasks. Hey guys, I'm Lighty, and today's video we're talking about flasks. All about flasks. Now, specifically we're discussing unique flasks, but I'll go over some of the basic flasks too. So for those who don't know, yes, a flask is a rechargeable potion that when used it consumes a certain amount of charges. Each flask has X amount of charges and recovers either life, mana, both, or gives some sort of bonus. The way that you get flask charges is you get 1 charge for killing a white mob, 3.5 for killing a magic mob, and 6 for killing a rare, and any unique mob you kill gives 11 charges. And then there's stuff in the tree also. There's a couple flask nodes in the tree, notably the alchemist cluster increases effect and duration. You have primal spirit cluster, flash charges gained. Also have stuff like druidic rite, flash charge gain, and flash duration. And there's also some more specific ones like recovery from life, recovery from mana, and also one over here for recovery speed. So there's a couple of flask nodes in tree, and basically flasks, you have 5 flasks at a time. You can have 5 flasks at a time. And although it says they're stored in your belt, you don't really need a belt to use them. These are every unique flask in the game, and they're all limit 1 per use, as in you could have one of the effect active at a time. I could have more than one, Vessel of Vinctar, for example, but if I activate them, they won't. It's not going to do anything to have more than one up. You know, if I have 2 Dying Suns, I'm not going to get 2 projectiles each. It's just there's no overlapping abilities, so there's really no point to have multiple unique flasks unless you can't sustain the duration of them. So I hopped over to my my Pathfinder for a second here, just to show you. Pathfinder, also called Flask Finder, basically is a subclass that is well, basically all about flasks. So some of the things have grant 100% flask charge. The flasks make you immune to every status effect in the game. It gives you a 20% chance to freeze, chance to ignite, blah, blah, blah. And even, 20% chance to not consume flash charge. So they have all the crazy flash shit. And pretty much every Pathfinder build grabs the same 3. They'll grab Alchemist, the cluster there, Primal Spirit, and Druidic Rite, which are the big 3 ones for flask nodes. And you can't combine that with stuff like the Wretch, which is basically a flask belt in itself. It allows for things like your Vinctars to last 10 seconds plus. Ed Series Promise lasts 10 seconds. 12-second Wise Oaks, Dying Sun lasting 10 seconds. It's crazy. This is like the utmost scenario of what a flask build can do. So let's go over for a second what every unique flask is. So every unique flask still has a base flask, and what I mean by that is Forbidden Taste, for example, still is a quartz flask. So the implicit aspect of it is still the same. Implicits don't change even if it's unique or not. So, oh my god. So if you look at, for example, the flask list here, you can see there's tons of different mana, tons of different life flasks. They're all essentially the same with hybrid flasks. Then you get to the utility flasks, and these are what most bases are based off of, okay? So the buff effect section where it says here, and the stats section, I guess, these are what the implicit of the flasks are. So if I have a flask that is a Stibnite flask, for example, where is it? Sins Rebirth is a Stibnite flask. It has the benefit of Stibnite on top of whatever the unique flask has. So in a lot of scenarios, it's beneficial to use not a unique flask or a magic flask. There are no rare flasks as of yet. Probably because I haven't figured out the balancing behind it. Depending if you need a flask that makes you either immune to bleed or immune to freeze, it might be beneficial to run a couple magic flasks. So let's go over what every flask does. First off, we'll talk about Blood of the Krui. Blood of the Krui is a unique sanctified life flask that essentially has a delayed large amount of life that it grants. When I push it, I won't gain any life, but once the duration's over, and boom, back to full. So it's a delayed full effect. It's kind of hard to use as far as the timing aspect of it. I've seen some people use it in conjunction with Val Righteous Fire. Even then, it gets a bit iffy. Next up, we have Forbidden Taste, which is a quartz flask, meaning it gives you phasing and attack and spell dodge. Recovers half your life on use. Then you take 15% of your max life as chaos per second. Now, it says per second, it's 4 seconds. 4 times 15 is 60% of your life. Okay, so again, this is going to recover half your life instantly, and then you're gonna take a bunch of damage as chaos damage. So this basically just it's gonna fucking heal you burst instantly, then chunk you for a lot of chaos damage. I guess if you're a build that has a lot of chaos res, it could be beneficial. So next up is Xerfe's Last Breath. It's a grand mana flask. Mana flask meaning if you're not at full mana, you could use it. If you're at full mana, you won't even be able to use it. And what this does, skills used during flask effect grant 800% of their mana cost as life. So they heal you as life. So for example, if I pop this flask and I start casting, it's going to start healing me with life. This has weird interactions with stuff like Skull's Bridle and has been used in the past in a lot of combo type builds. So essentially, aside from its niche application, it's kind of worthless. Following up, we have Laviana Spirit, which is a unique sanctified mana flask often used in the past for SRS or builds that required massive amounts of mana. All it says is your skills have no mana cost during flask effect, but similar to the fact that it is a mana flask, it will recover your mana. So basically, once you do use it, you're going to start recovering mana. During that effect, you don't use mana, but basically it's going to give you, I don't know, 3 to 5 seconds of where you have, well, basically infinite casting. It's like Val Clarity, but in a bottle. Next up is Divination Distillate, often used by certain MF builds throughout history. MF being Magic Find, grants light radius, a little bit of all res, but mostly it grants item rarity and item quantity. Now, the problem with this is, because it's a hybrid flask, the second your life or mana hits full, it is going to shut down. I use this again, 5, 4, 3, just stops at 3. So you have to basically have your health and mana low, or at least not at full. It can't hit full during the flask's effect for you to actually gain the IQ bonus. This is mostly used for culling. What I mean by culling is if you're just going to last hit a boss using Culling Strike, something that MF builds might use. A lot of people will get a boss to like 10% life and maybe swap to an MF character that just has culling. Then it becomes beneficial, but just when you're using it, make sure you don't have full life and mana, otherwise you will not gain the effect. Next we have the Writhing Jar as a hollowed hybrid flask. Hybrid flask similar to the situation before, where if you gain them, it's going to stop the effect. But the effect of this flask doesn't matter what your mana is, because this flask, well, it gives you worms. Now, I can't even show you what it does, because they removed that this flask can give you charges in your hideout. People were abusing the mechanic, spawning infinite amounts of worms, crashing and rolling back the server. So let's see what it actually looks like. So all the worm flask is going to do is it makes 2 little worms. Blech, there they are. Little fucking sausages pop out. And these last, well, they last until they die. So you can just follow them around pretty much. But these were used for stuff like boom, there they go, they die. So the duration isn't super long, but they're used for stuff like cast on crit builds. You could cast on crit builds that also grant flash charges, similar to the way the harvest works, and you just basically spam 5 worm flasks, making 10 worms every half second. Your screen's covered in worms, you're critting. That's basically the gist of that. So aside from builds that use that, it doesn't have any real practical application. Next up, you have Lion's Roar. Now, Lion's Roar is a granite flask, meaning it gives you armor. It knocks back enemies in an area on flask use. 75% chance to cause enemies to flee on use. 35 more melee physical damage, which is the real basic drawback of this. And it adds knockback during flask effect. Roar because it looks like a little roar when you do it. So, this has upside. Obviously, it gives you a massive amount of melee fizz. Downside, any build that's going to be using melee fizz or want melee fizz really doesn't want knockback or fear. You don't want the enemy to be going away from you. You want them to be on you so you can kill them. That being said, it's a great damage boost. Really good for things like War Chief totems, single target like Azaro or at Zeri or Breach Lords or Shaper. Lion's Roar is a great, effective extra link you're using. It's like a small melee fizz in a flask. Next up, Dodri's Elixir, Greater Mana Flask. This is pretty simple. You take 10% of your life as cast damage on use. Bam, 10% of life gone, and I gain a 1 of each charge. It's a pretty shit flask. Next up, we have Cruciating Flask, also known as a little baby dragon flask. Cruciating Flask is a ruby flask, which in general you'd like to have an LE base because they just have the most value, getting the 6% max res from them. The implicit is insane. Also stuff like a Quartz Flask isn't super good. Same with life flasks in general. You generally want to have a utility flask as the base for your unique flask because they just are better. The Cruciating Flask is a very, again, niche interaction-based flask. It gives you chaos damage, does not bypass energy shield during flask effect. Same effect that you get from stuff like Shavs. Basically, it's a little Shavs in a flask. And it also removes all but 1 life. So it's like your CI, and remove life is regenerated as ES over 2 seconds. Regarding Umbilicus Immortalis, as far as it will kill your zombies, minion instability and make your zombies basically detonate is some cool interaction. But aside from that, it's got a pretty niche use as well. Next up is Taste of Hate. Mine's Legacy. There are non-Legacy versions. Non-Legacy just says 30%, 20% for the second line. But it's an insane flask. It gives you cold res. Again, it's a sapphire flask, so it's got a better base. 30% of fizz added as cold, or taken as cold also, and 30% chance to avoid being chill and frozen. So it gives you a bunch of damage, it mitigates a bunch of fizz, prevents your cold damage through its implicit, and it also prevents you from being frozen chilled. Overall, an insane flask. Next up, you have Kiara's Silver Flask. Kiara's Determination is a flask used often in place of stun immunity. It's kind of a catch-all, immune to freeze, chill, curse, and stun. So it's a great flask. It's just the downside is it lasts fucking not very long. And what it does is, aside from that, it gives you Onslaught, which is 20% faster attack, moving cast speed. But it's used a lot for Valspark, Val builds in general that don't want to sacrifice the next slot or use Unwavering Stance on Tree. They just want to get stun immunity somehow and freeze immunity. It basically provides all that in the flask. As long as you can click it every couple seconds, it's pretty worthwhile. It says 3.5 seconds on a build like Pathfinder. You'll still have it over 6-7 seconds. Next we have Sin's Rebirth Stibnite Flask. This is a newer flask. The Stibnite base, so it gives you evasion and a smoke cloud. Again, smoke cloud, if your enemy's inside of a smoke cloud, they have a, chance to miss pretty much. Their accuracy goes down, your evasion goes up in some fashion, and this flask is insane. So removes burning on use, immunity to ignite on use, so it prevents you from taking really any fire damage. Then it gives you Unholy Might. Now Unholy Might, as it says, you deal extra chaos damage based on your fizz. It's 30% fizz added as chaos, which is a large amount in chaos, being an unmitigatable, essentially in most scenarios, form of damage. It's fucking insane. That's why this flask is also like 8 to 10x. Great flask for any fizz build, basically. Next up, we have Dying Sun. This is dropped off Shaper. A lot of these flasks have drop specific. Above the Krui, League specific, Xeraphes League specific, Laviana's League specific. Cruciating is card specific. You only get it from a divination card. Vinctar's is map specific. Dying Sun again drops only off of Shaper. It's a Ruby flask again, great base. 30% AoE, 2 additional projectiles, so it has an insane ability. Now this is really, really good for things that double dip in that mechanic. What I mean by that is stuff like Kinetic Blast, stuff like Tornado Shot, stuff like Explosive Arrow, which are projectile-based build and have AoE. So it affects them on both fronts, making their AoE larger, potentially overlapping more, along with just giving them more projectiles, giving them more clear speed. If you're a Pathfinder, this ability is scaled up to the point where you have 45% AoE and 3 additional projectiles. Because projectiles is a value that can be modified, you do actually get an additional projectile from using it. Next up, we have Vinctar's, Vessel Vinctar's. This is the nerfed version. Still insane, completely gross version. It's dropped from the Vinctar's map by killing the dude in the center. There's 3 different other variations of them. They all have the same increased charges used, shocks enemies nearby. You are shocked during flask effect, but it is a topaz. 20% of fizz leached as mana and life. The only thing that changes is it says 20% of fizz converted to lightning. That could also mean added lightning to spells, added lightning to attacks, and lightning penetration. There's different variations depending on your build. One might be better than the other. But in general, Vinctar's is Vinctar's. Even if you don't have the one you wanted, it's still probably going to be better than nothing because it's Vinctar's. Next up, we have Overflowing Chalice, which is the flask for flasks. What this does is it has increased charge recovery, means it lasts longer and it charges faster. You gain no charges during the effect of the flask. So while the flask is active, you actually cannot gain flask charges. And it is a sulfur flask, meaning it puts the increased damage and consecrate ground on the floor, regenerating your life by a little bit. But all it does is increases the flask charges gains by the other flasks. So basically, if I have Vinctar's up and then I pop Chalice, while Chalice is up and I'm killing shit, Vinctar's will gain flask charges at twice the rate, or 100% increased charge gain. Essentially, it's a flask that makes every build kind of like a Pathfinder. Next up is Sorrow the Divine Sulfur Flask. It's a sulfur flask, so it grants increased damage by 40%, and it grants Consecrate effect. Now, what this is really good, because Conk Ground is so nice when you have Zealot's Oath, it's going to make your 2% regen in the area go to your ES instead of your life. And it lasts a really long time. So this is okay for RF builds that are just kind of sitting on a boss that could drop 2 of them even, and just kind of walk around in circles next to the boss, and it regens a lot of the life. It lasts quite a long time, and it comes back pretty fast. Next we have Edziri's Promise, again gated behind Edziri herself. There's no variations of it, just different roll tiers. This is a Amethyst Flask, meaning it grants chaos resistance, and it just gives a percentage of your fizz and element added as chaos damage, and it gives you 2% chaos leech. Pretty much every build in the game runs Edziri Promise in a way at some point. It's your go-to starter flask. Normally they don't cost very much. A lot of these flasks can be quite expensive, especially stuff like Vingtar's Dying Sun, Cinderbirth Taste. Edziri's normally 5C. Even week 1, it's not very expensive when people are still farming Edziri. So it's a great flask with a lot of purpose. Next up we have Rumi's Concoction, which has been nerfed 2 to 3 times during history. It's a grant flask, so it grants armor, and all it does is it gives you a chance to block. That's all it is. But again, that's scaled up with Pathfinder. This basically gives you block cap. So it's a great little defensive flask. If you don't need to run a Granite or a Basalt for the suffixes, which I mean by using a Heat or Bleed. So if you have Bleed and Freeze immunity and you still want to run a Granite, might as well just run Rumi's basically. Next up, we have Rot Gut, which really is just a piece of shit. But what it does is a Quicksilver Flask that makes you go fucking vroom fast. Along with that, it chance to gain Flask charges when you deal a crit, so it has like almost like the Surgeon's mod on Flasks. More increased move speed during Flask effect, so it's 60 plus move speed. Consumes frenzy charges on use. For example, if I had a frenzy, I've killed myself. So if I had a frenzy charge right here and I consume it on use, it'll give me a 1 second of onslaught per frenzy charge. Get 3 frenzy charges here, and I use it. I will gain 3 seconds of onslaught. I guess really only used for raiders or builds that have massive amount of frenzy charges and can get them back quicker. Really, if you want to buff your clear speed, I think there's better ways, but Rotgut is an option, I guess. Next up, we have Wise Oak, which is the newest Flask edition in the game, I believe, and it actually had an art redone to look like a little jelly bean. Still kind of does. It's a Bismuth Flask, meaning it gains all res. So its wording is kind of complicated. During Flask effect, 10% reduced damage taken of each element for which your uncapped elemental resistance is the lowest. Right, and then the inverse is 20% pen for the highest. Okay, so all this means is whatever your highest res is, you have 20% pen. Whatever your lowest res is, you have 10% reduction. If your values are the same, meaning the second number, so if these all said 75, that means I would just gain, which you could do technically with like a lot of resistance fidgeting and moving your gear around. If the numbers are matched, you gain the abilities for all of the reses. So if I had, 135 res across the board on the right side, I would gain 10% reduced damage taken from Fire, Cold, Lightning, and 20% pen for Fire, Cold, Lightning. That's kind of insane for Flask that also, for some reason, is level 8. I don't understand why it's so low level, or why it's so common. They're like 3C now. And finally, we have Witchfire Brew. Witchfire Brew is a Stibnite Flask. Again, we have 2 Stibnite Flasks now, but for some reason we still don't have a unique diamond flask. Question mark. What this does is Stibnite effect. On top of that, you have increased flash charges used, which means you can only use it twice basically per thing, and it'll give you increased damage over time during flask effect. So a lot of dot damage, it's like 50 to 75%. It also grants you level 21 vulnerability curse aura, which essentially is a vuln on blasphemy. So that's what the looks like blasphemy around me during flask effect. So if you want to play a build that you don't want to actually have the links for the curses, but you just want to use a curse, you still have to do it through additional cursing. So if I had already enfeeble on blasphemy, I still have to pick up something like Whispers of Doom, otherwise it won't work. It says it grants the aura, but it can't grant it if you already have a curse active. But it's a great way to get a free curse. It's really good for builds like Essence Strain, RF, stuff like that. So this is a post I saved a long last time ago, and it's regarding just how insane flasks are. This is specifically, well, I guess regarding Vingtars, just how the leech works, and compared to every other leech aspect in the game, you could just see 2%, 2%. 2, 1.2, 0.4, 0.2, 0.4. And then you look at Vingtars, and it's 20%. This was after the Flask nerf. This is after Vingtar got nerfed. Vingtars be 30%. That's also mana, and it's basically going to be instant because you have Valpact. So that's insane. And it's just, when you look at this, it really visualizes, holy fuck, that's a pretty big gap in power there. Another thing I wanted to look at was this post a long ass time ago, October 2016, months ago. I saved this and it shows a visual representation of what these flasks look like after you have all the flask nodes. So this is what Vingtars looks like, and if you look at this as a normal flask, you'd say this would never be allowed in the game. So 75 lightning res, 9 max all res, okay, and then 30 leech across the board. That's gross, and it says it lasts 6.72 seconds, but with all the flask things, that's lasting 10 seconds. That's 10 seconds of that. Okay, next we have Taste of Hate. Again, 75 and 9 for the Sapphire, and then 35%. His take is cold, 45% extra damage, and basically a 50% chance to avoid freeze and cold. Insane. Rumi's gives you 45 block chance on that your shield, and look, you just hit cap block. I mean, it's kind of gross to think that you could use Rumi's as Pathfinder and you just have capped block. Like, and then you look at max block builds, which have to choose a specific subclass, spec into 30 nodes across the whole tree, and one flask can just do it for you. At Serious Promise, not as overpowered as the other two ones. 52 chaos res is pretty nice though, and again, just a fuck ton of damage. Finally, Dying Sun. Again, because it's a ruby flask, that's also a large factor of it, is the fact that builds that use a flask build will be using a ruby, a sapphire, and a topaz in the shape of Dying Sun, Taste of Hate, and Vingtars. They're just sitting at way over capped res and like 90 plus all res. This grants you 45% AoE and a 3% proj, like we discussed earlier. So if you have any questions regarding flasks, let me know. The role that flasks play and how flasks interact with duration, charges gained, and increased effectiveness is to the point where they are completely trivializing a lot of content in the game, which is kind of sad, where your flasks are more important than your gear for a lot of builds at the moment. Not that flasks should just be a life and a mana flask, that's fine, that's a little boring, but yeah, there's got to be some middle ground here. So I'm Lighty. I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you guys out there. Bye.